What do you do when you're asked to design a monument to a fallen president, a president who became a martyr before he could finish reshaping America? And the only thing the grieving widow insists on is that visitors must be able to see the ocean. Standing on a windswept peninsula jutting into Boston Harbor, surrounded by water on three sides and the sprawling campus of the University of Massachusetts, rises one of the most geometrically pure and emotionally resonant buildings in American architecture, a stark white concrete and glass structure that seems almost impossibly simple at first glance but reveals itself as a masterwork of spatial drama, light manipulation, and symbolic power. This is the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, designed by the legendary architect I.M Pei and completed in 1979 after a 15-year journey from commission to completion, a journey that would test Pei's patience, resolve, and architectural genius while ultimately producing what many consider his finest work in one of the most successful presidential libraries ever built. The building, with its soaring 9-story glass pavilion that frames views of the Atlantic Ocean and creates a contemplative space flooded with natural light, alongside its geometric concrete volumes that house the museum galleries, represents not just a repository for historical documents but a profound meditation on memory, loss, public service, and the American democratic project. Pei's design, characterized by the bold geometric clarity that would become his signature, but deployed here with particular sensitivity to program and emotion, manages to be simultaneously monumental and intimate, abstract and deeply humane, creating spaces that honor Kennedy's legacy without descending into sentimentality, while giving visitors an experience that moves from darkness and tragedy through reflection toward hope and renewal. To understand why this building matters and how it achieved its powerful effects, we need to dive into its conception, its battles, its brilliant design strategies, and its lasting impact on how we memorialize our leaders and tell national stories through architecture. The story of the Kennedy Library begins not in 1979 when it opened, not even in 1964 when Pei was selected as architect, but really in Dallas on November 22, 1963, when 3 gunshots shattered not just a presidency but a nation's sense of itself and its future. Within weeks of Kennedy's assassination, his family and close advisors began planning for a presidential library, understanding that controlling the narrative and preserving the legacy would require a physical place where that story could be told. Jackie Kennedy, the president's widow who would prove to be perhaps the most influential client in the project's history, insisted on several things. She wanted a significant architect capable of creating something more than a conventional archive building. She wanted the library to serve an educational mission that would inspire future generations of public servants, and perhaps most importantly, she wanted visitors to be able to see the ocean because Jack had loved the sea. The selection of I.M Pei as architect was inspired. At the time, in 1964, Pei was an established but not yet legendary figure, known for elegant modernist buildings that combined bold geometry with sophisticated urban thinking, and he had recently completed the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, which demonstrated his ability to work with powerful natural landscapes. Pei, who was born in China in 1917 and immigrated to the United States to study architecture at MIT and Harvard, brought a unique sensibility that merged the clarity and rationalism of European modernism with a sense of monumentality and symbolic weight that would prove perfect for this commission. The original plan was to build the library on a site along the Charles River near Harvard Square in Cambridge, directly adjacent to Harvard University where Kennedy had been an undergraduate, and this seemed perfect: the connection to Kennedy's educational roots, the urban vitality of Harvard Square, the prominence of the location. Pei designed an elaborate scheme for this site featuring a dramatic pyramid-shaped building that would have been one of his most ambitious projects, and the design was unveiled with great fanfare in 1973. But then everything fell apart. Cambridge residents, already anxious about Harvard's expansion into their neighborhoods, rebelled against the prospect of a massive building that would draw millions of tourists, create traffic nightmares, and fundamentally alter the character of their community. After years of increasingly bitter fights with neighborhood groups, lawsuits, and political maneuvering, the Kennedy family and Pei made the painful decision to abandon the Harvard site and find a new location. This is where the story gets interesting architecturally because the crisis of losing the original site forced Pei to completely rethink his approach, and the building we have today, designed for a new site at Columbia Point in Dorchester on a peninsula in Boston Harbor, is actually far better than what would have been built in Cambridge. The Columbia Point site, offered by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the University of Massachusetts, was in 1975 frankly kind of a dump, a neglected area with decaying public housing, contaminated land, and limited access, about as far from Harvard Square's prestige as you could get. But Pei, demonstrating the mark of a great architect, saw the potential. The site's isolation could become contemplative distance. The waterfront location could fulfill Jackie Kennedy's requirement for ocean views in the most dramatic way possible. And the relatively blank slate meant fewer constraints on the building's form and orientation. Pei scrapped his pyramid design and went back to fundamentals, asking what this building needed to be and do, and the answer he arrived at would produce one of the most spatially sophisticated museum experiences in America. The design concept that Pei developed for the Columbia Point site is deceptively simple in its elements but complex and carefully orchestrated in how those elements combine to create experience. The building consists essentially of three main components: a low concrete podium containing the archives and administrative spaces, a series of connected concrete volumes housing the museum galleries, and the showstopper, a 9-story tall glass pavilion that serves as the ceremonial entrance and contemplative conclusion to the museum journey. These elements are arranged on the site to take maximum advantage of the peninsula's geography, with the building oriented so that the glass pavilion faces northeast toward the harbor and the open Atlantic beyond, and with careful landscape design creating an approach sequence that builds anticipation as visitors move from parking areas through landscape grounds toward the building's entrance. The geometry Pei employs is characteristically rigorous. Circles, triangles, and rectangles combine in plan to create spatial variety while maintaining overall order, and the building's massing uses pure geometric forms, cylinders, and rectangular blocks, composed with the clarity of a suprematist painting, but deployed to serve very specific programmatic and experiential purposes. The exterior materials are limited to white and dark gray concrete, with precise formwork creating smooth surfaces that emphasize the geometry, and glass, lots of glass, particularly in the pavilion where floor-to-ceiling glazing creates that crucial connection to water and sky. This material restraint was partly economic. The budget after the Cambridge debacle was tight, but Pei turned constraint into virtue, using limited means to achieve maximum impact through proportion, light, and spatial sequence. The entry experience begins not with the glass pavilion, which you can see from a distance but don't enter directly, but through a low, compressed concrete threshold that immediately establishes a sense of occasion while keeping you oriented toward the ground, and this compression is crucial because it sets up the release that comes later. Once inside, visitors enter a darkened theater where a short film introduces Kennedy's life and presidency, and this decision to begin in darkness with moving images rather than objects is brilliant. It establishes emotional connection and narrative context before visitors encounter any artifacts, and it means everyone starts the museum journey with shared knowledge and primed emotions. From the theater, the route leads into the museum galleries, which unfold as a sequence of interconnected spaces that tell Kennedy's story chronologically, and here Pei's spatial design works in perfect concert with the exhibition design. The galleries are housed in those concrete volumes we saw from outside, and they're deliberately diverse in character, some intimate and residential in scale when showing Kennedy's early life, some more expansive and formal when dealing with his presidency, some raw and emotional when addressing the assassination. The circulation path through these spaces is carefully controlled but never feels forced, with the route occasionally opening to windows that give glimpses of the harbor, reminding you of the larger world beyond the story being told inside. And these moments of release prevent the galleries from becoming oppressive despite dealing with difficult subject matter. The technical sophistication of these gallery spaces shouldn't be underestimated. They needed to accommodate diverse artifacts from documents to furniture to multimedia displays. They required precise environmental control to preserve sensitive materials. They needed flexibility to allow exhibitions to evolve over time, and they had to maintain architectural character while serving the exhibition designer's needs. Pei achieved this through a system of neutral backgrounds, white walls, controlled lighting, and simple geometric rooms that provide consistent quality space without competing with the exhibits, basically creating a three-dimensional armature onto which exhibition content could be layered. The lighting strategy in the galleries combines artificial sources with carefully limited natural light, using clear-story windows in some spaces to bring in daylight while avoiding direct sun that could damage artifacts, and the result is spaces that feel alive and connected to the building's exterior form while maintaining museum-quality environmental standards. But the absolute genius of the Kennedy Library's design reveals itself at the end of the museum sequence, when visitors emerge from the galleries, which have been dealing with increasingly dark subject matter culminating in the assassination and its aftermath, into the glass pavilion, and this moment is one of the most powerful spatial experiences in American architecture. You move from relatively dark, enclosed concrete spaces filled with the weight of history and tragedy, and suddenly you're in this soaring light-filled volume, 9 stories tall, with floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides looking out over Boston Harbor toward the ocean, and the emotional release is overwhelming. Pei has orchestrated the entire building to lead to this moment: the compression at entry, the darkness of the theater, the controlled sequence through the galleries, all building toward this cathartic release into light and space and views of water and sky. The pavilion is furnished simply with American flags and a single piece, a reproduction of Kennedy's Oval Office desk, creating a contemplative space that invites reflection rather than didactic instruction, and the message is clear. Kennedy's story is over, his time was cut short, but we continue, democracy continues, the American project continues, and we're left looking toward the horizon with hope despite tragedy. This is architecture not just as container but as emotional orchestration, using spatial sequence, light, volume, and views to create meaning that transcends what any exhibition text or artifact could achieve alone. The structural system supporting this architectural vision required careful engineering to achieve Pei's geometric clarity, while spanning the large volumes he needed, particularly in the glass pavilion. The pavilion's structure consists of a steel frame with columns positioned to minimize their visual presence, allowing the space to read as a pure glass volume rather than a caged enclosure, and the engineering to make those slender columns carry 9 stories of glass and resist wind loads off the harbor was sophisticated for its time. The concrete gallery volumes use reinforced concrete bearing walls and frames, which provide both structure and the massive quality Pei wanted for these spaces. And the careful coordination between structural system and architectural expression means that structure never feels like an afterthought, but instead reinforces the building's geometric logic. The glazing system in the pavilion uses insulated glass units that were among the largest available when the building was designed, and achieving the visual clarity Pei demanded while meeting energy performance requirements required careful specification and detailing, with thermally broken aluminum frames and high-performance glass that was cutting edge in the late 1970s. The environmental systems had to navigate competing demands. The archives require strict temperature and humidity control to preserve documents and artifacts, some of which are irreplaceable original materials from Kennedy's presidency, while the public spaces needed to accommodate large crowds with variable occupancy, and the glass pavilion presented thermal challenges with high heat gain in summer and heat loss in winter. Pei worked with mechanical engineers to tuck systems into the building's geometric composition, using the concrete volumes and the archive podium to house mechanical rooms and distribution systems, while keeping the architectural spaces free of visible ductwork and equipment. The integration of security, which became increasingly important for presidential libraries after various incidents and threats, had to be accomplished without turning the building into a fortress, and this was managed through a combination of discrete surveillance, controlled access points, and separation between public and secure archive areas that visitors never perceive as intrusive. The landscape design by the office of Hideo Sasaki works as an extension of Pei's geometric composition, using berms, paths, and plantings to create an approach sequence and to mediate between the building's stark geometry and the somewhat chaotic context of the surrounding university campus and harbor edge. The plaza areas immediately around the building use granite paving that echoes the concrete's color and precision, creating outdoor rooms that extend the building's architectural language while providing gathering spaces and view platforms overlooking the harbor. The long-term challenge of maintaining the building on this exposed coastal site, where salt air and weather constantly attack materials, required careful detailed design at every joint and connection, with particular attention to protecting the concrete from water infiltration and the metal window systems from corrosion, and the building has required ongoing maintenance and periodic renovations to keep it performing as designed. The reception of the Kennedy Library when it opened in October 1979 was overwhelmingly positive, with critics recognizing that Pei had achieved something special. A building that functioned superbly as a museum and archive while also operating symbolically as a memorial without being maudlin or manipulative. Ada Louise Huxtable, the influential architecture critic of the New York Times, called it a distinguished work of architecture and praised Pei's consummate design skill. And this critical approval helped cement the building's reputation and Pei's status as one of America's most important architects. The public response was equally enthusiastic, with visitors consistently reporting being moved by the experience, particularly that moment of emergence into the glass pavilion, and the building quickly became one of Boston's most visited attractions, drawing more than 2 million visitors in some years. The Kennedy family, especially Jackie Kennedy Onassis as she became after remarrying, expressed satisfaction with the final building, and this was significant given how closely she had been involved throughout the design process, and how many compromises and changes the project had endured. The building's influence on subsequent presidential libraries and museum design more broadly was substantial. It demonstrated that these institutions could be architecturally significant, while still serving their documentary and educational functions, and it showed how spatial sequence and architectural experience could enhance rather than compete with exhibition content. Later presidential libraries, from the Reagan Library by Hugh Stubbins to the Clinton Library by Polshek Partnership to the Bush Library by Robert A.M. Stern, all show some debt to the Kennedy Library's example, though none have matched its spatial sophistication or emotional power. The building won numerous awards, including the American Institute of Architects Honor Award, and it's consistently cited in surveys as one of the most important buildings of the post-war period in America. Beyond its architectural merit, the Kennedy Library has succeeded in its educational mission, hosting scholars who use the archives, running programs for students, and serving as a venue for discussions of public service and democratic values, so it functions not just as backward-looking memorial, but as forward-looking institution. The building has aged well, both physically and conceptually. Regular maintenance and a major renovation in the early 1990s that added new gallery space have kept it in excellent condition, and the design's geometric clarity and material restraint mean it hasn't been subject to the stylistic dating that affects more trendy contemporaries. One of the fascinating aspects of the Kennedy Library is how Pei managed to create a building that's both deeply specific to its purpose, memorializing this particular president and telling this particular American story, while also embodying broader architectural principles about geometry, light, material, and spatial sequence that make it interesting and successful as pure architecture independent of its program. You could theoretically strip out all the Kennedy-specific content, and you'd still have a brilliant building in its manipulation of compression and release, darkness and light, enclosure and openness, and this is the mark of great architecture versus mere building. It works on multiple levels simultaneously, satisfying practical requirements while also operating formally and experientially in ways that transcend function. The Kennedy Library represents a particular moment in American architecture when modernism's geometric abstraction and faith in architectural form to convey meaning was still culturally viable, before postmodernism's irony and historical reference became dominant, and in retrospect it stands as one of the finest achievements of that modernist tradition. Pei would go on to design many celebrated buildings, including the controversial glass pyramid at the Louvre in Paris, the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and he'd win the Pritzker Prize in 1983, but many critics and historians still consider the Kennedy Library his masterpiece, the building where all his talents, geometric clarity, spatial sophistication, sensitivity to sight and landscape, ability to work with difficult clients and complex programs came together most successfully. The building also represents something important about American culture's relationship to its leaders and its history. The decision to create these presidential libraries and to invest in quality architecture for them reflects a belief that how we preserve and present our history matters, that the physical spaces where we encounter the past shape our understanding and our values, and that architecture can play a meaningful role in national self-understanding and civic education. The Kennedy Library, standing on its peninsula looking out toward the Atlantic, has become more than a repository of documents or a museum of artifacts. It's become a place of pilgrimage for those who remember Kennedy and a place of education for those who don't, a space where personal memory and national mythology intersect, and where architecture provides the stage for that intersection. Pei's genius was understanding that this required more than just a handsome building or even a functional museum. It required a choreographed experience that would move visitors emotionally while also giving them space to form their own relationships to the history being presented. And the building succeeds because it finds that balance between authorial control and visitor freedom, between memorial solemnity and hopeful openness. When you stand in that glass pavilion looking out at the harbor with the flags moving in the breeze filtering through the ventilation system and the light pouring in from three sides, you understand viscerally what Pei was after: a space that acknowledges loss and honors memory while also insisting on possibility and continuation, a space that looks backward at what was while also looking forward toward what might be. And that's not a bad metaphor for what democracy itself requires from us. The Kennedy Library reminds us that architecture, when practiced at the highest level with rigorous thinking about space, light, material, and sequence, can create experiences that stay with us, that change how we think and feel, that become part of our understanding of important events and ideas. And that's why studying buildings like this matters for architects and architecture students. Not to copy their forms or details, but to understand their strategies and ambitions, and to see what becomes possible when design is pursued with clarity of vision and excellence of execution. If this deep dive into one of America's great modern buildings got you thinking about architecture differently or made you want to visit Boston to experience that glass pavilion yourself, consider subscribing to UrbArchitect for more explorations of the buildings that shape our cities, our culture, and our lives, because architecture is too important and too fascinating to leave to the architects alone. It belongs to all of us, and understanding it better helps us demand better from our built environment and appreciate the extraordinary when we encounter it.